The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you'd like to participate in a Pause for Thought, tune in on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with a Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, we're glad to have you with us this evening. I'd like to remind all of you that this is a live call-in show. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927. If you'd like to call in, ask questions, make comments, correct me or any of the other guests that we have tonight regarding the topic of the evening. And, of course, the topic of the evening is the proposed City of St. George here in Baton Rouge, which I was surprised to find out just how many people who live in what will become St. George don't really understand anything about. Anyway, so with me tonight I have two guests. One is M.E. Cormier, who, if you have taken an interest in St. George, you've probably heard of already. M.E. Cormier is a lifelong Baton Rougean. She has a degree from LSU in business and a background in disaster management. You'll be good to have around if St. George gets passed, I think. She volunteers with many community organizations and is especially proud of her work for CASA, which is the Court-Appointed Special Advocate Program, where you take a child as a case, your case, and you go and make sure all this, everything is taken care of, all the legal loops are, gone, so the kid is taken care of. Okay.
That's correct.
Right, okay. And she is a proud product of public school and an even prouder public school parent. She has been leading the opposition to St. George Breakaway, to the St. George Breakaway proposal for the last 6 years. So welcome and glad to have you, M.E. Cormier.
Thank you very much.
And I look forward to learning a lot from you. And we also have a rising star, a future star here at WHYR. Hey, that rhymed. I was a poet and didn't realize it.
A poet and didn't know it.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. Marissa Mayer will be here. She was originally going to come on to observe and just learn a little bit about how a show is conducted, and who better to learn from than the expert. But alas, she drew the short straw and got me. Anyway, good evening, Marissa.
Good evening.
Okay, well, let's get started off here. Emmy, if you would, give us just a brief rundown of what the City of St. George issue is all about.
Sure. So it originally started in 2012 and 2013 with a group of people that went to go through the legislature to form their own school district. It didn't pass the requirement to get on the ballot. So during the floor remarks, a legislator remarked, well, you can't just have a school district, you need to be a city first. Well, they took that as the word of God, and they have been, ever since 2013, attempting to form their own city first.
Okay, what was their problem with the school system? Why did they want their own school district?
They decided that they didn't want to put their kids in the current East Baton Rouge Parish public school system, and they decided that they didn't want to help improve the school system, that they were just going to wipe their hands of it and form their own separate independent school district.
Okay, so do you know for a fact that they never made an attempt to change the school district?
I know for a fact that the gentleman...
Or to improve the schools, I mean.
The gentlemen involved in the current, the two chairmen of the current petition have not participated in public school in East Baton Rouge. That's correct.
Okay, yeah, and that's kind of common in America. People don't understand how things work in the government. All they know is they don't like it, so they want to quit. And that seems consistent everywhere. So, okay then. So let's see. They decided to form their own city so that they could create their own school district, and that's where we are now. Now, you said this started back in 2015, right?
They originally circulated a petition beginning in late 2013 throughout 2014 and 2015. They turned that petition in. At the same time, we were able to go door to door and collect withdrawals of signatures from that same petition, and ultimately that was the successful defeation. They were defeated by 71 signatures, and we turned in over 100 withdrawals in the last 24 hours.
So this was basically you went around to people who had signed the petition and informed them of
of what
would be happening?
Yes, we informed of the negative consequences if St. George were to come to fruition. We did not try to convince anyone. We merely asked them if they wanted to withdraw, and we gave them the opportunity and the paperwork to do so. There's no form to withdraw your name. You have to, get it in writing somehow. So we designed a one-pager, had it approved by the Registrar of Voters, and we gave people the information and the opportunity, and they chose that opportunity. Over 1,200 people withdrew their names from the petition.
Wow, that's important, and that's what I'm trying to do now with my neighbors, because I live in St. George, and I don't want to get stuck in what I suspect is going to be, as one business person here in Baton Rouge stated, a bad dream waiting, just on its way. Anyhow, so there was some issue with the map. Now, this first petition you're talking about, that was to create the separate city, right?
Yes.
And they presented a map of what the proposed city would be?
Yeah, the laws in 2015 are different than the laws now governing the 2018 petition, and some of that was by design. They changed the laws, given their results and experiences of the 2015 petition. They changed the laws. Some of them were in their favor, some of them were in our favor, if you'll put it that way. So the laws are different, but originally in 2015, when they first made their map, the law said they had to take the entire unincorporated contiguous area. Since then, they were able to make changes in the legislature that allowed them to actually design every element and every outline of their map, and they took full advantage of that in this new petition.
And they came up with a new map, right?
It's an entirely new map. It's dramatically different from the previous map in 2015. The borders are quite different and quite gerrymandered, in my opinion.
Well, can you elaborate on what the difference is? Who was included the first time that's not included the second time?
So a large area to the west, the Gardier area, was exclusively left out of the new map. They purposefully omitted the entire Gardier area from their new map. The African American population of registered voters in the original map in 2015 was around 20%. Now the African American population of registered voters is only 12%. And that's due large in part by the boundaries that were created in the new map by St. George.
Okay, so that sounds to me, and I'm going to use this term because we'll use it again later, as an attempt to subvert the democratic process, right?
It is certainly by design. Every element of their map, they purposefully drew out and drew in the streets that they did and did not want in their favor. And they definitely
because they're trying to rig the outcome is what they're trying to do.
It certainly seems that way.
Okay, yeah, all right, that's fine. Now, that this is a very, very big thing they're trying to do here, and it's going to have a huge impact on the entire parish, is it not?
Absolutely.
So I would think, yeah, go ahead.
The mayor has asked all of the non-essential budget departments to present a 20% reduction in their budgets. And that's city parish. So that's the entire parish could feel a 20% reduction in non-necessary services. Or the entire parish could feel a tax increase to make up for that deficit.
Okay, but then surely knowing that, then the majority of residents in East Baton Rouge Parish will vote against it, right?
It seems to me to be pretty easy on the right side of this issue, and the right side of this issue is a no on St. George.
Right, but is the entire population of East Baton Rouge Parish voting on this issue?
No, unfortunately, only the map of the proposed city of St. George, only the people who are in St. George get to vote, despite the fact that we will have a ripple effect parish-wide almost immediately of a reduction in services. We do not get the right to vote because, for example, I live 2 blocks from the proposed incorporation of St. George. So a neighborhood within a neighborhood will now be in a completely separate city, and I'll have no control over what happens to me.
Right. Yeah, and that was my cue for you to express outrage over that. But that's okay. That's all right. But yeah, after they rigged or jerry-rigged the size and the map of St. George to be in their favor, they then contrived to get the vote to separate and create the city limited to just the people that live in St. George.
Technically, that's the Louisiana State Constitution that does say that.
Well, that's what they did, though, right?
Well, so the Louisiana State Constitution was rewritten that way a long time ago. Originally, Louisiana used to have statewide votes on every little thing. Napoleonic Code is a weird thing. And the legislatures, I think, in the 30s or 40s decided, you know what, that's too much. That's too many people. We've got too many votes. It's too expensive. So they narrowed the scope of the voting population to, quote, affected. Well, in my opinion, that's too narrow because I believe that the affected population should include the entire parish.
Because the entire parish is affected.
That's correct.
That's ridiculous, yeah.
Well, and we tried to get legislation passed this past legislative session to allow the entire parish to vote, and unfortunately St. George showed up in droves to the committee meeting and stifled the rest of our opportunity to vote. They literally took away my right to vote.
So they subverted the democratic process or undermined it again, so to speak. And the reason I'm using that term and bringing that up is when they submitted, I guess it was their first petition, they submitted it early because they didn't have they had enough signatures but not as many as they could get, or was that the most recent petition?
In 2015, they submitted the petition, and the laws are the same with that. They submitted their petition, and the registrar vets it, and he has in perpetuity to take to vet it, so he took several months. And the registrar came back and said he didn't have enough signatures, so they had 60 days to collect the signatures they needed, and I think it was around 3,000 short if memory serves. This go-round, they were able to go back basically to the same people that had already signed in 2015, so they already had the list of people they knew were going to sign.
Right.
They knew they were going to get the signatures. They designed the map to get the signatures. They knew the list of people who signed the previous petition. So they've been very calculated with their efforts so far.
Okay, and they then, for some reason, filed the petition sooner than they had intended, and they did it according to their spokesperson, Lionel Rainey. He's quoted here in an article in the Baton Rouge Advocate. We chose to turn the petition in early due to the constant efforts of the city of Baton Rouge to undermine the democratic process. So, when here they rigged the map of St. George to undermine the process, they overwhelmed the process of selecting who was going to vote to limit. It seems to me they're the ones guilty of trying to undermine the democratic process. But you go ahead.
It certainly feels that way. I will say that one of the changes in the legislature that I talked about earlier that changed the dynamics between the 2015 and 2018 maps was the withdrawal campaign that I discussed earlier was obviously the Achilles heel of the St. George petition in 2015. It's what allowed us to defeat the petition. So they made changes in the legislature that severely narrowed that window of opportunity of withdrawal and defined it as 5 days from when the petition is turned in to the registrar. So conspiracy theorists will say they turned it in early because I happen to have been out of the country the week that they turned in their petition 45 days early, and I took the red eye that night and came home and was able to file a public records request the very next day to get a copy of the petition, and we did as much public outreach as we possibly could in that 5-day period. And we obviously did not have as strong of a withdrawal campaign this time as we did last time because that opportunity was taken from us.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to remind the listeners that you're listening to Wayne Parker, Amy Cormier. Here on A Pause for Thought, we're discussing the proposed City of St. George and the potential consequences and pitfalls that we shall get to in a moment. 343-9927 is the number to call, 343-9927. Give us a shout with your comments, questions, or challenges. So, Emmy, let's talk about money.
Okay.
The people who support, separating and becoming St. George claim they're going to have all the money they need for everything and even have a surplus, I believe.
That is their claim. That's correct.
Okay.
I would say that that's a very robust claim. I think that if anybody... So I think that we'll take this in several pieces. The first is that their budget was prepared by an accountant with their directive that said, well, we represent 19.2% of the parish, so we should get 19.2% of the sales tax and et cetera, and we're only going to cost 19.2% of what the parish does, and they pulled about 8 items. So we're only going to cost 19.2% of the roads. We're only going to cost 19.2% of the drainage. Well, first of all, that calculation is not correct. It's actually over 22% that they represent. Second of all, they are a low-lying area of the parish, So they actually have, they cost more than other areas in the parish in their drainage issues. We saw that in the flood of 2016. The majority of the 46,000 people who flooded in this parish were in the St. George area. So everybody knows that the drainage is going to cost more than 19.2%. The Klein Peter substation alone is $29 million a year worth of phone calls when their area only generates, I think, about $13 million. So
isn't that the whole point of having a larger pool of revenues?
Absolutely.
So
right now, the entire parish pools their resources together to make sure that the entire parish has what it needs, no matter what it costs. The parish isn't saying, you know what, St. George, you cost me more in drainage, so I'm going to charge you more. That's not how it works.
Right. But they're nevertheless, these people that support St. George think they can leave and cover that cost with this 2% sales tax. Now, what other sources of revenue is St. George going to have after they leave, if they do?
They'll have a 2% sales tax, and that represents about 91% of their budget, and then they'll have a couple $1 million a year in permitting and occupational licenses and stuff like that. So the main bread and butter is sales tax. So 91%. The parish does around 60% is based on sales tax. Portland does 0%. So the idea of having 91% of your entire budget based on sales tax, what if we have another recession?
Yeah.
What if we have a bad year and no one's buying anything from Lowe's and Target?
Which is where we're heading already, yeah.
And so there goes your budget.
Yeah, good point. But nevertheless, they're going to create, according to this little doorknob card I'm looking at, 2 new government bureaucracies with 91% of their revenues coming from this 2% sales tax. Number one, why 2?
So the one is the city, and the
Okay.
2 is the school district.
That's right, and they're not even talking about a school district right now,
No.
which was the original impetus for getting this all going.
It's really confusing, actually. I'm very confused. So in one breath, they say that Baton Rouge is terrible because the school system is terrible and we have to have our own school system. But in the next breath, they say, well, don't ask me about the school system. That's not on the ballot. That's later.
Okay, yeah. All right, well then, so in reality, it looks like what they're planning and claiming they'll have to fund this experiment isn't going to make it. I mean, we haven't even talked about when they create the new school district or when they have to hire a new police chief, which I think the state law requires that all cities have to have at least a police chief.
Yes, they have to have a police chief.
Fire protection.
Fire protection will remain the same because of the districts are already outlined. So what they won't have is a police department.
Right.
So one of the other reasons they say that Baton Rouge is bad is crime. Well, if you're not going to increase police protection or even have your own police department to support the laws of your new city, I don't see how you're going to minimize crime. Furthermore, like we talked about earlier, the amount of property tax that they have to pay for that they have for sheriffs does not pay cost for cost. If it's a city parish that pays for it, that's fine. We can all subsidize that cost. But once you become your own city, the laws change. You can't get anything for free. You owe dollar for dollar what the sheriff's station costs. So the agreement that Central has is technically in violation of the law. They are doing extra duty, 1099. That can't be. They have to pay dollar for dollar what the actual cost of the sheriff's deputies and patrolling that goes on in their city. And St. George is going to have to pay that bill too.
Okay, but they've got that all worked out already, don't they?
They have numbers on a budget that don't match reality.
Okay. But I mean, they have a firm plan for all of this, right? I mean, everything, they have it in place. They laid this out in front of the voters and said, look, once we separate, if they do, on the 12th, this is how we are going to approach it. We're going to have everything functioning right away, right?
I've seen no plan whatsoever.
Neither is anybody else.
No, I have no idea where City Hall would be. Who do they want for their mayor? Who's going to be their city clerk? The governor has to appoint all these people within the first 6 months. Well, who are these people going to be? So it's not nothing that these continue to be unanswered. On October 12th, you're not just voting about whether or not St. George would be a city, but you're throwing chance to the wind. We also don't know who our governor is going to be on October 12th. So which governor is appointing which people in charge of St. George that are then going to be in charge of us?
Right. And figuring out how everything's going to be laid out and paid for.
Yes.
and they haven't made any promises. This unknown future person that has made no promises as to not raising taxes or anything else.
Even if they did make a promise that they weren't going to raise taxes, the people who are saying we won't raise your taxes are not in charge of a city. That's not legally binding. They can say whatever they want to get you to the polls.
Yep. I'd like to let everybody know again that this is Wayne Parker with a pause for thought. We're talking with M.E. Cormier regarding the proposed city of St. George. 343-9927 is the number to call if you'd like to share your views, challenges, or what have you. 343-9927. So, one other point about their calculation with how much they're going to get with the sales tax. Their calculation used the percentage of the proposed St. George city compared with the population of East Baton Rouge Parish plus the populations of Central, Zachary, and Baker.
Correct. The LSU economist said very clearly that they overestimated their revenues. And they overestimated it because they miscalculated it.
Right. Well, they included areas that are already taking their cut of the sales tax.
That's correct.
So that pool is not available for St. George to get, so it shouldn't have been included in their calculations.
Correct.
The only available, and that's where you came up with the difference of 19.2% and 22 point something or whatever.
That's what the LSU economist came back with. Yeah.
Yes, right. So, and that seems to me like either incompetence on their part or deliberate. I don't know, but
I won't prescribe motives. I will tell you that there are too many mistakes and too many unknowns. These are serious questions that have been asked multiple times. These issues have been brought to their attention both by me, by the city parish, by other elected officials. They refuse to answer these questions. There is no plan for a city government. There is no plan for a school system. So we have to be very careful on October 12th. We can't be too excited at the euphoria of a new city is going to be great. But there's so much more to that. There are so many unanswered questions that remain unanswered to this day.
Yes, and I'll make a confession here, which I've had many times on this show. As a reformed right-wing nut job, the local government lower taxes thing really plays well if you don't look beneath the surface.
Unfortunately, we've seen in this very parish that is not reality. Every city that has broken away from the city parish has had to raise taxes multiple times.
Of course, that is reality.
And those are much smaller cities compared to St. George, and their tax budget was not based on 91% of sales tax.
Great, that's great. So it sounds scary, but that reminds me too, the uncertainty, the fact that there is no transition plan.
Yes.
I recall reading a quick blurb somewhere, and I'm not sure if it's accurate, just like my one about the property taxes that I was incorrect about, but I asked you first. Apparently, if there's no transition plan, then St. George can't collect their portion of the 2% sales tax. Is that true?
There is some ambiguity about what happens in this transition period of, say, 6 months where there is no governor, there's no mayor, there's no police chief.
Yeah, who's going to collect the money?
Who's going to collect the money? Yeah, who's going to write the check? So there is an immediate uncertainty. Everybody knows what Baton Rouge looks like on October 13th. No one on this earth knows what St. George looks like on October 13th. Of 2019, of 2020, of 2021, there is no answer. There is no way to know.
And there's no plan, no guess. It's just reassurances from the planners, the proponents of it.
That's right.
And mistaken budget calculations and the like.
That's right.
So, it's sounding rather grim. And I think I told you before the show, I encountered one of my neighbors this morning when he was walking his dog, and I was loading my bird feeders. And I asked him, I said, hey, man, what do you know about this St. George? And he said, I heard a little bit about it. No, I don't know anything. And I said, dude, and I shared a couple of things that you have mentioned here with him, and he's like, wow, maybe I better look into that. And I told him I would talk to him later. And I'm going to canvass my neighborhood this weekend and try to let people know what we're facing here, because they just think, okay, somebody says it's a good idea, it probably is. They wouldn't do it if it wasn't, and they're going to vote for it.
Unfortunately, not everybody's motives are pure. And like I said before, there's no legally binding agreement that the St. George organizers have to have. They can say whatever they want to get you to vote for them, just like everybody else. So they can say no new taxes, but that doesn't actually equate to no new taxes.
And I really think that they're not being deliberately deceitful. This, of course, is my opinion. I think they're just naive. They're full of their small government ideology. And I know this because I was once one of those people, a long time ago. But they're full of the ideology. Therefore, they have an answer for everything, because ideologies work perfectly in a person's mind. I mean, that's the only place anything works perfectly, is in a person's mind. And that's what we're dealing with here, I think, is they are probably convinced that this is all going to work itself out just fine.
Ideology does not equal reality.
No, it's an ideal,
yeah.
And you never reach the ideal. You strive for it, but you're never going to reach it. That's the naive part, I think, is like.
But I mean, ideal for whom? So, and then who do you
Good
hurt?
point.
Who do you hurt on the way to your idea of ideal? So 3,832 students would be immediately displaced from their school system if St. George were to get a school system after a city. That's 3,832 families that would be uprooted. Furthermore, if they were to get a school district that matched their city boundaries, they would have a school capacity crisis of over 2,000 students.
They're going to have temporary buildings, they said, and house them in there.
That's great 5 years down the road, but how do you pay for those temporary buildings on day one? You've got to have those temporary buildings on day one of your school system. You've got to have a desk in that temporary building. You've got to have a teacher for that temporary building. Those 2,000 students deserve not to be educationally homeless on the first day.
I agree. Yeah, and of course, if you ask them, they have that all taken care of. That's all been worked out, I guess, on this 2% sales tax and fees and whatnot.
Schools are not included in their budget. Schools are
okay,
entirely
cool.
separate, and in fact, when we were able to ask them questions about it, they said that they wouldn't be the ones to design a school system. They're only here for the city. School system, somebody else at some other time, and that's not our business.
But the school system was the reason why they started all this in the first place.
That was my understanding, but Drew Merle at the library on his night to speak on the 12th specifically stated that they are not the ones that will be designing the school system, and they do not know who would be.
Great. So yet another uncertainty we're facing here, and yet there is a certainty that all of these uncertainties will still be there if people vote to leave and create St. George.
It seems to be a theme.
The only thing that I think we're sure of is that East Baton Rouge Parish is going to be seriously hurt by it.
Absolutely. What this imaginary line represents now is nothing, meaningless. It's a capricious boundary. But once you actually build that metaphorical wall between two cities and splice the city parish and splice the city, you have rung a bell that cannot be unrung, and it will be a mess on October 13th of this year, next year, and for the next 10 years, or forever.
Have any businessmen or business people in what will be St. George come out in favor of this?
I don't know of any specifically.
Yeah, I did a quick Google to find out, and I didn't see anything. All I found were about 24 local business executives recently met at a press conference and spoke out against it, saying it's a bad idea.
Absolutely. Arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, we are better together. We are BR.
I agree. And, and it's important to point out to some people, too, that as St. George, the St. George area, which is a thing now, it's just not a separate city, it needs more revenue for drainage than other parts of the city. So those parts of the city are having to pay more, basically, or more of their taxes, or
a disproportionate amount of property taxes is coming from the northern part of the city parish and serving the southeastern part of the city parish as it relates to drainage. That's
right,
correct.
But that's
sheriff's deputies.
Right. But that's the case with anything elsewhere in the parish. There are some other areas who have special needs that are getting extra tax money.
Absolutely. That's how a cooperative agreement works.
It's a give and take kind of thing. And
we are better together. We're able to help a larger, wider, needier community base when we pool our taxpayer money and have a greater uplifting city for the entire parish.
And the alternative to that, we're being told, is uncertain. Let's just jump off and figure it out as we go.
I'm not one to make decisions like that. I kind of like to know what I'm up against up front.
Especially when you're faced with such serious issues and so many uncertainties. We are about ready to wrap up, Emmy. And Marissa, I'm glad you had a chance to sit in and listen. I hope everyone listening here has learned a few things that they didn't know before about the proposed city of St. George. Anything closing for comments?
Yes, and if you'd like to know more information, you can visit our website, 1BTR. That's ONEBTR.com. We've got a great FAQ.
Okay, frequently asked questions,
That's
right?
it.
Okay,
Yes.
just want to make sure. Oh, sometimes I get tripped up on those things, you know. Anyway, you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Emmy Cormier talking about the proposed and hopefully failed effort to create a city of St. George. We're out of time. We got to go. We thank you for listening. You have a good night.